She was only 6 years old when her whole world changed. The small house she once called home no longer felt safe. Her mother had disappeared from her life, and her father was nowhere to be found. One night, the police came, and with them came strangers who spoke softly but firmly. They told her they were there to help, but to a child it didn't feel like help. It felt like losing everything. She sat in the back of a car with her little backpack, clutching a teddy bear that was missing one eye. That bear was the only familiar thing she had left. The ride seemed endless. She pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the streetlights blur as tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't understand why she couldn't stay in her home. She didn't understand why her mother never came back. All she knew was that she was going to a new place with new people, and she was terrified. When the car stopped, a man stood at the doorway of a small, neat house. His name was Daniel. He wasn't young, and he wasn't dressed fancy, just an ordinary man in a faded shirt and jeans. But his eyes were warm, and his smile, though a little nervous, was gentle. He bent down slightly, trying not to look too tall or frightening, and said, "Hello there. I've been waiting for you." She didn't say a word. She just held her teddy bear tighter. She wanted to run back to the car, but the lady beside her encouraged her softly, guiding her to the porch. Daniel opened the door and let them in. The house smelled of fresh bread and soap. It was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. A blanket was folded neatly on the couch, and a small lamp glowed in the corner. That night, Daniel showed her the room he had prepared. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and clean. The bed had soft sheets, and on the nightstand sat a little lamp shaped like a moon. She stared at it, surprised. No one had ever thought to give her a lamp like that before. "Would you like me to leave the light on for you tonight?" Daniel asked kindly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He smiled again and said, "That's fine. The moon will keep watch over you." Then he left the door open just a little so she wouldn't feel trapped. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the new sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the wooden floor, the wind brushing against the window. Every sound made her heart jump. She feared that someone would come and take her away again. But when she peeked out the door, she saw Daniel sitting in the living room with a book. He wasn't watching her, but he didn't leave either. It was as if he was silently saying, "You're not alone." Over the next few days, she spoke very little. At breakfast, Daniel would make her toast with butter and jam, placing a glass of milk by her side. She would eat quietly, staring at the table, but he never rushed her to talk. He would ask simple questions like, "Do you want more jam?" Or "Would you like to go to the park today?" His voice was steady, calm, and patient. One afternoon, when he took her to the park, she watched other kids run and laugh. She stayed close to him, clutching his hand, afraid to let go. He didn't push her to play. Instead, he sat with her on the bench, pointing out the birds in the trees. "Look, that one's a robin," he said softly. For the first time, she let go of his hand, only to point at the bird too. That small moment gave him hope. And somewhere deep inside her, a tiny spark of trust began to form. Still, at night, she cried silently into her pillow. She didn't want him to hear, but sometimes he did. On those nights, Daniel didn't come in to lecture her or tell her to stop. He would simply walk past her door, pause, and whisper, "It's all right. You're safe here." His footsteps would fade, but the words stayed with her, wrapping around her heart like a blanket. Days turned into weeks. The fear didn't vanish overnight, but slowly, the house began to feel less strange. The smell of fresh bread, the soft glow of the moon lamp, and the sound of Daniel humming while washing dishes became familiar. And, for a girl who had lost everything, that small sense of safety meant more than words could say. In her heart, though she wouldn't admit it yet, she had started to believe that maybe this man wasn't just another temporary stop. Maybe, just maybe, he could be the home she never had. The first few weeks in Daniel's house were not easy. For a child who had already seen too much loss, trust did not come quickly. She carried her small backpack everywhere, as if someone might appear at any moment to take her away again. Even though Daniel told her this was her room now, she refused to unpack fully. Her clothes stayed folded in the bag, and the teddy bear never left her arms. Daniel noticed, but he never pushed her. He moved slowly, speaking gently like a man who understood that broken hearts could not be fixed in a single day. At breakfast, he made her eggs, sometimes pancakes shaped like little circles that he tried to flip without breaking. She would eat quietly, barely making a sound, while he sipped his coffee and pretended not to watch her too closely. When he walked her to school, she clutched his hand with surprising strength, not because she trusted him fully yet, but because the world still felt too big, too dangerous, and she needed something to hold on to. At the school gates, she often froze. The sound of children laughing and running scared her, reminding her she was different. She wasn't like the other kids with moms and dads waiting for them at the end of the day, but Daniel had a rule. He would always be there when the final bell rang. She tested it at first, staring at the school doors, waiting to see if maybe one day he would forget. But every afternoon, without fail, he was there. Sometimes with a small smile, sometimes holding a snack in his hand like an apple or a cookie, as if to say, "I kept my promise." At night, things were harder. She often woke up crying, whispering her mother's name or staring at the shadows in the corner of the room. Daniel never barged in, never scolded her for being afraid. Instead, he would knock softly, peek in, and ask, "Do you want me to sit here for a while?" Sometimes she said nothing, but he would still sit in the hallway, his back against the wall, letting her know she wasn't alone. Slowly, something inside her began to change. It wasn't dramatic like in the movies. It was quiet, steady, like the way water smooths a stone over time. She began to laugh at his silly jokes when he burned the toast. She started leaving her backpack in the corner of the room instead of carrying it everywhere. One day, she even asked if they could bake cookies together. Daniel nearly dropped the mixing bowl in surprise, but he smiled and said, "Of course." That evening, the kitchen was a mess. Flour was on the counter, sugar spilled on the floor, and the cookies came out a little too crispy. But when she giggled at the smoke rising from the oven, Daniel thought it was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. The neighbors began to notice too. One woman said to Daniel, "She's looking brighter these days. You must be doing something right." Daniel didn't know how to respond. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like a man trying to keep a promise to a child who deserved better than what life had given her. Still, challenges lingered. At school, she was quiet and withdrawn. She didn't make friends easily. When other children mentioned their moms, she sometimes shut down, staring at the ground as if she wasn't even in the room. Daniel would ask her about her day, but she usually just shrugged. He didn't push, but he let her know he was ready to listen whenever she wanted to talk. One rainy afternoon, something shifted. She came home with wet shoes, silent as usual. But then she looked at Daniel and said, "Can I tell you something?" His heart skipped, but he kept his tone calm. "Of course," he said. She hesitated, then whispered, "I don't like it when the other kids talk about their moms. It makes me feel like I don't belong anywhere." Daniel knelt down, looking her in the eyes. "You belong here," he said firmly. "With me, this is your home. You don't ever have to feel like you don't belong." She didn't answer right away, but for the first time she leaned against him, resting her small head on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but for Daniel it was everything. That night she unpacked one of her shirts and put it in the dresser. Just one. But it was a beginning. For years she had lived with fear, expecting people to leave. But Daniel was showing her, little by little, that maybe this time was different. Maybe this house, with its warm light and steady rhythm, could be more than just another stop. Maybe, just maybe, it could be home. As the months passed, the distance between them began to shrink. Not through big dramatic events, but through the little things Daniel did every single day. To the outside world, they might have looked ordinary, but to her they became the threads of safety and love weaving quietly into her life. Daniel made it his mission to show up in the small ways. He never missed a school meeting, even when work left him tired. He sat in the tiny wooden chairs meant for children, listening carefully as teachers spoke about her progress. He didn't brag or make big speeches, but he always asked, "What can I do better for her at home?" The teachers would glance at him, surprised at how seriously he took it. At her soccer games, he became the loudest cheerleader. His voice carried across the field every time she kicked the ball, whether she scored or missed. Other parents clapped politely, but Daniel clapped like the game depended on it. She pretended to be embarrassed, rolling her eyes when her teammates teased, "Your dad cheers louder than anyone." But deep down, those words made her heart warm, because to her, he was starting to feel like a real dad. Even on quiet nights, his presence mattered. When nightmares woke her in the dark, Daniel would sit by her bed with a cup of warm milk. He never asked her to explain the dreams. He just stayed until her breathing slowed and her eyes closed again. Sometimes she'd wake in the middle of the night to find the glass still on her nightstand, the milk half finished and the faint memory of his steady hand resting on her shoulder. The little acts didn't stop at home. When school projects came up, Daniel helped in ways that surprised her. Once, she had to build a model of the solar system. She worried because she'd never had anyone to help with projects before, but Daniel stayed up late with her, painting styrofoam balls in different colors, stringing them carefully with wire, and letting her hold the brush for the finishing touches. When she presented it in class, her teacher smiled and said, "Great teamwork." For the first time, she felt proud not just of the project, but of the fact she had someone who stood beside her in making it. And then there were the simple routines that built trust. Every morning, Daniel packed her lunch and slipped in a small note. Sometimes it was silly, like a doodle of a smiling sun. Sometimes it was a few words, "You're braver than you think," or "Good luck on your spelling test." She never told him, but she kept those notes tucked in a small box under her bed, each one a reminder that someone was thinking of her. The neighbors began noticing the bond, too. On weekends, Daniel took her to the local park, where they'd walk the trails or feed ducks at the pond. People would greet them, saying things like, "You two look good together," or "She's grown so much." Each comment made her secretly happy, even though she pretended not to care. For once, she felt like part of a picture that looked complete. Of course, there were rough days. Some mornings she refused to get out of bed, weighed down by old fears she couldn't explain. Other days, anger spilled out of her and slammed doors in harsh words. But Daniel never responded with anger of his own. Instead, he'd wait, giving her space, and later quietly say, "I'm not going anywhere, no matter how mad you get." His steady patience confused her at first. She wasn't used to people staying. One evening, after one of those hard days, she surprised herself, sitting at the dinner table staring at the pasta he made. She mumbled the word "Dad" without even realizing it. The sound hung in the air. She froze, embarrassed, waiting for him to react. But Daniel didn't make it a big moment. He didn't cry or hug her or say how much it meant. He simply smiled gently and answered yes, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. That quiet acceptance meant more than any celebration. From that night on, she didn't always call him Dad, but she knew she could, and that was enough. The truth was, Daniel's love wasn't shown in grand gestures. It was in the daily acts that most people might overlook. Leaving the porch light on until she was asleep, fixing her bike chain when it slipped, or waiting at the end of the driveway with an umbrella on rainy afternoons. Each small act told her the same story, that she mattered, that she was wanted, and that she was safe. And though she couldn't say it yet, deep in her heart she knew. This man who started as her foster dad was becoming something far greater. Life in Daniel's house was not a perfect fairy tale. For every step forward, there were days that felt like 2 steps back. Being a foster parent meant constant visits from social workers, stacks of paperwork, and interviews that made the house feel less like a home and more like a place under inspection. Every few months, a stranger with a clipboard would knock on the door. They'd ask questions, take notes, and glance around the rooms as if searching for flaws. To her, these visits were terrifying. She never knew if the answers she gave could change everything. She worried that one wrong word might make them take her away again. She would sit on the couch with her teddy bear, her little hands gripping it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Daniel noticed her fear, but he couldn't take those visits away. What he could do was sit beside her, his arm resting gently on the back of the couch, never pressuring her to speak but letting her feel his steady presence. When the social worker left, he always told her, "You're safe here. No one is going to take you away." She wanted to believe him, but part of her still lived in fear of the unknown. Money was another struggle. Daniel wasn't wealthy. He worked long shifts at the hardware store, often coming home tired, his shirt stained with dust. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, and sometimes she overheard him sighing late at night as he looked at them. But no matter how tight things got, she never went without. He found ways to make small moments special, like pancakes for dinner on nights when the fridge was almost empty, or hot cocoa after a long day, even if it meant cutting corners somewhere else. The emotional struggles were harder. Sometimes the girl's past would surface in unexpected ways. A sudden noise could make her flinch. A word, a memory, or even a smell could bring tears to her eyes. On some days, she shut herself in her room, refusing to talk. Other times, anger spilled out of her like a storm. She would yell, slam doors, and shout things she didn't mean. "You're not my real dad," or "You're just pretending to care." Those words cut deep, but Daniel never raised his voice back. He understood they weren't truly meant for him. They were echoes of old wounds, of people who had left her behind. On those hard days, he would give her space, then quietly slide a plate of food outside her door. Later, when she finally opened it, she'd see the food still warm and a note that read, "I'll always be here." At school, the struggles continued. Some children whispered about her being in foster care, and though teachers tried to stop it, the word stung. She came home one afternoon, her eyes red, her backpack dragging on the ground. "They said I don't have a real family," she whispered. Daniel knelt down, looked her straight in the eyes, and said firmly, "You have me. That's as real as it gets." But even with his love, there were moments when she doubted it. She had been moved before, taken from house to house, each time being told it was for the best. Deep inside, she feared Daniel would get tired of her too. So she tested him. She pushed boundaries, refused to listen, and even packed her backpack once, announcing she was leaving. Daniel didn't stop her with force. He just stood quietly at the door and said, "If you go, I can't stop you. But this will always be your home, and I will always be waiting for you." She stared at him for a long time, then dropped the bag and burst into tears. The struggles weren't one-sided either. Daniel had doubts of his own. Late at night, he sometimes wondered if he was good enough. Could he truly give her what she needed? Could love alone make up for everything she had lost? He was just an ordinary man with an ordinary job. What if one day she realized he wasn't enough? But every morning when she came sleepily into the kitchen and sat at the table, waiting for her toast, he reminded himself, showing up mattered more than perfection. And so, through the struggles, through the tears, the slammed doors, the financial worries, and the endless social worker visits, the bond between them grew stronger. It wasn't polished or easy. It was messy, fragile, and hard. But it was real. Slowly, she began to see something she had never seen before, someone who didn't give up on her. And Daniel, through every hardship, saw something just as powerful. A little girl who, despite all her pain, still had the courage to keep hoping for love. The years passed more quickly than either of them realized. The little girl who once clung to a teddy bear now stood taller, her hair longer, her voice stronger. She was no longer the frightened 6-year-old who had walked into Daniel's house with trembling hands. She was a teenager now, 15, with a spark in her eyes that sometimes reminded Daniel of the child she used to be, and sometimes of the young woman she was becoming. But even as she grew, one thing never changed. Daniel was still there. He was there at every school concert, at every doctor's appointment, at every moment when she needed him most. He was there when she cried over bad grades, when she laughed over silly jokes, and when she asked difficult questions about the family she had lost. One quiet evening, after dinner, she surprised him. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the remains of spaghetti still on their plates. She was twirling her fork in slow circles when she suddenly asked, "Why haven't you ever given up on me?" The question struck Daniel like lightning. He set down his fork, leaned back in his chair, and looked at her carefully. "Because you're mine," he said softly. "You may not have been born to me, but from the moment you walked into my home, you became my daughter. I don't give up on family." She blinked, her eyes shiny as if she wanted to believe every word but was still afraid. She didn't reply, but something in her expression shifted. That night, after she went to bed, Daniel sat in the living room with a heavy heart. For years he had thought about it, dreamed about it, but now the thought burned stronger than ever. Adoption. He didn't just want to be her foster dad anymore. He wanted to be her forever dad. He wanted to erase the word temporary from her life once and for all. But it wasn't a simple choice. Adoption meant more paperwork, more court hearings, more questions. It also meant opening old wounds for her, reminding her of the family she had lost. Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was the right time or if he was selfish for wanting it. The next morning, he found his answer in the smallest of ways. She came to the table, hair messy from sleep, and said without thinking, "Morning, Dad." She froze when she realized what she had called him, but Daniel didn't make a big deal of it. He just smiled and slid her a plate of toast. Inside, though, his heart swelled. The word felt right. It felt like home. A week later, Daniel sat across from a lawyer in a small office, nervously tapping his fingers on the armrest. The lawyer explained the process, the forms, the hearings, and the challenges. Daniel listened carefully, nodding. When the lawyer asked, "Are you sure you want to go through this?" "It's a big responsibility," Daniel answered without hesitation. "I've already been her father for years. I just need the world to see it too." Meanwhile, the girl noticed changes. Daniel seemed busier, more distracted, making phone calls when he thought she wasn't listening. At first, she worried something was wrong. Then one evening, he sat her down on the couch. His hands shook slightly as he spoke. "I want to ask you something," he began, "but you don't have to answer right away. Take as much time as you need." She frowned, nervous. "What is it?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I'd like to adopt you. Not just be your foster dad, but your real dad forever. But only if you want that too." The room went silent. Her heart pounded in her chest. For so long she had lived with the fear of being temporary, of being unwanted. To hear those words, it felt almost unreal. She stared at him, unsure if she could even speak. Finally, her voice broke into a whisper. "You really mean it?" Daniel nodded. More than anything. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't leap into his arms or shout with joy. Instead, she sat quietly, letting the words sink in, feeling the weight of what they meant. A forever home, a forever dad, something she had dreamed about but never dared to believe could come true. From that moment, something inside her changed. The fear that had always lived in her chest didn't vanish overnight, but it loosened. The idea that this man wanted her forever gave her a strength she had never felt before. The turning point had come, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet truth of a promise made at a kitchen table. A promise that would carry them both into the next chapter of their lives. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and from the moment she woke up, the air felt different. The house was unusually quiet, as though even the walls understood the weight of what was about to happen. Daniel was up early, dressed in a suit that looked a little stiff on him. He had borrowed a tie from a neighbor because he thought it was important to look his best. She noticed how he kept checking his watch, straightening his collar, and wiping his palms against his trousers. For her, the morning felt heavy. She wore a simple dress Daniel had helped her pick out, and though she looked put together on the outside, her stomach churned with nerves. Adoption sounded beautiful, but the idea of sitting in front of a judge terrified her. What if she said the wrong thing? What if the judge decided Daniel wasn't good enough? The fear of being moved again, of losing the only real home she had ever known, wrapped around her like a shadow. The drive to the courthouse was silent. She stared out the window, watching trees blur past while Daniel gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. Every so often, he glanced at her as if to reassure himself that she was really there beside him. When they pulled into the parking lot, he parked and turned to her. "No matter what happens in there," he said softly, "you are my daughter. That won't change." His voice cracked slightly, but he forced a smile. Inside the courthouse, the air was cold, and everything felt too big. High ceilings, marble floors, and rows of wooden benches. She clung to Daniel's hand, her small fingers trembling inside his. People in suits walked briskly down the halls, papers tucked under their arms, voices echoing against the walls. To her, it all felt intimidating, like stepping into another world. When their case was called, they walked into the courtroom together. The judge sat high above them, wearing glasses that made him look serious and unreadable. A clerk shuffled papers, and a few other people sat in the back watching. To the girl, it felt like every eye in the room was fixed on her. They took their seats, and the hearing began. The lawyer spoke first, explaining Daniel's years of fostering, his clean record, his dedication. The social worker gave her testimony too, describing how Daniel had provided stability and love when the girl needed it most. Every word should have been comforting, but the girl's heart thudded faster and faster. She knew her turn was coming. Finally, the judge looked down at her. His voice was calm but firm. "Young lady," he said, "I need to hear from you. Do you want this man to adopt you? Do you want him to be your father? Not just today, but forever?" The courtroom went still. She could feel Daniel's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, steady but gentle, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. For a moment, her mind went blank. A dozen fears rushed through her, memories of being left, of hearing promises broken. But then she looked up at Daniel. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't pleading. He was just watching her with those same kind, patient eyes he'd always had, the eyes that had been there on her first night in his home, the eyes that had been there at every soccer game, every nightmare, every moment she needed him. Her lips trembled, but then the words came. "Yes," she whispered. Then stronger. "Yes, he's not just my foster dad. He's my real dad. He's been my dad every single day since I walked into his house. I want the world to know it." Gasps rippled softly through the room. Even the clerk paused for a moment, pen hovering in the air. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. He nodded once slowly, then picked up his pen. Daniel's eyes brimmed with tears, though he blinked quickly, not wanting to cry in front of her. He squeezed her shoulder gently, his whole body trembling with relief. The fear, the years of waiting, the endless paperwork, suddenly it all felt worth it. The judge cleared his throat. "Then it is decided," he said. "From this day forward, you are no longer foster father and foster daughter. You are father and daughter in every way that matters under the law." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, loud and final. For her, it was more than a sound. It was the sound of belonging, the sound of being chosen, the sound of finally being home. The gavel had struck, but the moment didn't end there. The room was still, as if everyone inside knew something bigger than law and paperwork had just taken place. The adoption was official, yet there was something inside her chest, something she hadn't said, something she had carried for years, waiting for the right moment. Her hands trembled in her lap. She could feel Daniel's presence beside her, steady as always, his warmth like a shield against the cold formality of the courtroom. The judge had already begun moving on to the next case, the clerk scribbling notes, the lawyer gathering papers. It would have been easy to stay silent, to let the hearing end quietly. But silence no longer felt enough. She stood. The chair creaked loudly against the polished floor, and all eyes turned toward her. Her heart pounded, but for the first time, she didn't shrink under the weight of those stares. She looked at the judge, her voice trembling at first, but rising with every word. "He's not just my foster dad," she said. "He's my dad. He's been my dad since the first day I came into his house." Her throat tightened, but she kept going. "He's the one who makes me breakfast. He's the one who stays up when I have nightmares. He's the one who cheers the loudest at my games, even when I miss the ball. He's the one who never gave up on me. Not once." The courtroom grew so quiet that even the sound of her breathing seemed loud. The judge leaned forward, listening intently. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "I used to think nobody wanted me," she continued. "Every time I got moved to a new house, I thought, this is it. I'll never belong anywhere. But then I met him." She turned slightly, her eyes finding Daniel's. He was already crying silently, his hands clasped together tightly in front of him. She took a shaky breath and whispered the words that had lived in her heart for years. "He didn't have to love me, but he did. He chose me, and I choose him. He's my real dad, no matter what blood says. I just wanted everyone to know." For a moment, no one moved. Then the judge removed his glasses, pressing them against his eyes. The clerk sniffled softly, pretending to be focused on her papers. Even the lawyer had lowered his pen, watching the scene with quiet reverence. Daniel couldn't stay seated any longer. He stood and placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. His voice was raw, barely more than a whisper. "I've never been prouder of you in my life." She leaned into him then, not caring who was watching. For so long she had kept her feelings hidden, afraid they might be too heavy, too much. But speaking them out loud felt like setting herself free. It was more than an answer to the judge's question. It was her truth, her confession, her claim to the father who had never once let her down. As they left the courtroom, people nodded to them, some offering soft congratulations, others simply watching with expressions of quiet respect. But for her, the world outside felt brighter than it ever had. The sunlight on the courthouse steps warmed her skin, and the breeze felt alive with possibility. She looked up at Daniel, who was holding the signed adoption papers in his hand, as though they were made of gold. "Can we go home now?" she asked softly. He laughed, still wiping at his eyes. "Home," he repeated. "Yes, let's go home." And for the first time in her life, she understood exactly what that word meant. It wasn't just walls or a roof. It wasn't just a place where you slept. Home was Daniel's steady voice. Home was his hand in hers. Home was the promise that no matter what storms came, She would never face them alone again. The ride home from the courthouse felt different than any drive before. The same streets, the same traffic lights, the same houses passing by outside the window. But to her, it felt like the world had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't going back to a foster home. She was going back to her home. Daniel drove in silence, though every few minutes he would glance at her with a smile that never quite left his face. He kept tapping the envelope of adoption papers on the steering wheel, as if to remind himself it was real. She held the teddy bear she had carried since that first night, now a little more worn but somehow more precious than ever. For the first time, she realized it didn't just remind her of what she had lost. It also reminded her of what she had gained. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel cut the engine and turned to her. "You know," he said with a small grin, "this is the first time I get to say it for real. Welcome home, daughter." Her throat tightened, but this time it wasn't from fear. She smiled back, tears filling her eyes, and whispered, "Thanks, Dad." Inside, the house looked exactly as it always did. The same couch, the same lamp glowing softly in the corner, the same smell of fresh bread that Daniel always managed to fill the kitchen with. But somehow everything felt different. The air was lighter, warmer. It wasn't just a place she was staying in anymore. It was permanent. It was hers. That evening, Daniel cooked her favorite meal, macaroni and cheese with a side of garlic bread. He joked that it wasn't fancy enough for such a special day, but she laughed and told him it was perfect. As they ate, she caught herself looking around the room, memorizing every detail. This wasn't temporary anymore. Every wall, every picture, every corner belonged to their story now. After dinner, Daniel pulled something out from the drawer. It was a small photo frame with a picture of the two of them, taken years ago at the park. She was younger, smiling shyly while Daniel had his arm awkwardly around her shoulders. The photo had always sat on a shelf, but tonight he handed it to her. "I think it's time we put this one right in the center of the living room," he said. She stared at it for a long time, then hugged it close to her chest. "It's not just a picture anymore," she whispered. "It's proof." That night, as she lay in bed, she noticed something she had never felt before: peace. The moon lamp still glowed softly on her nightstand, just as it had the very first night she arrived. But tonight the light felt different. It wasn't there to guard against fear. It was there to shine on a future she finally believed in. Daniel passed by her door as he always did, but this time she called out before he could leave. "Dad?" He paused. "Yes? Thanks for never giving up on me." There was a silence, then his voice rough with emotion. "Never. Not in a million years." The sound of his footsteps faded, but she didn't feel alone. She knew that tomorrow he'd be there, and the day after that, and every day after, for the rest of her life. Years later, she would look back on this day, the courtroom, the confession, the ride home, and realize it wasn't just about paperwork or a judge's gavel. It was about love choosing her, staying with her, and never letting go. For the first time in her life, she had what she had always dreamed of, not just a house, not just a guardian, but a forever dad and a forever family. And that was everything.